A year ago, the head of state named Admiral Don Luis Carrero Blanco president of the government. Don Luis Carrero Blanco was sworn in at the Palacio del Pardo, capping an unmatched career serving Spain and its institutions. President Carrero Blanco's term in office was characterized by intense management, visits, meetings with distinguished foreign visitors, and inaugurations multiplied. That immense political activity was abruptly shattered on December 20th.
After Spain spent more than 30 years governed under the leadership of General Francisco Franco Bahamonde, the health of the caudillo and the Francoist system began to decline. The big national question was, after Franco, what? For many of the staunchest supporters of Francoism, there was one clear and distinct figure to ensure the continuation of the system of government and the principles of the national movement. That man was Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco, who by then was not only the only high-ranking official who had faithfully worked for Franco since the days of the Civil War, but also a man who had become de facto the right-hand man of Francoism, and who also maintained his own leadership. However, to the surprise of all Spaniards, when Franco's days were numbered due to his health, while Carrero Blanco was serving as president of the government, he was brutally assassinated with explosives in the final days of 1973. This assassination, unprecedented in 20th century Europe, which decisively impacted the fate of Spain, has not been without major controversies and investigations. They suggest that the version known by most Spaniards, that is, that it was an Euskadi ta Askatasuna attack, may be an incomplete version that does not fully explain this historical event. Join us to learn about the extraordinary life of Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco, the true successor of Franco in the government, and in addition, the controversial questions and theories surrounding his assassination. This is Reynaldo José Carrillo Vilches. This is the New Encyclopedia. And for those who don't know, let me remind you that we now have the New Encyclopedia in English and the New Encyclopedia in Portuguese. You can give us great support by joining both platforms, which you can find below, subscribing to both channels, liking the videos, leaving your comments, and watching the content, which has a lot of potential. Without further ado, let's start with today's video. Luis Carrero Blanco was born on March 4, 1904 in Santoña, Cantabria, northern Spain. A descendant of a line of military men on his father's and grandfather's side, Luis developed a great interest in the military, especially in the Navy, perhaps inspired by the vastness of the elegant and cold Cantabrian Sea and the ships that sailed its waters and adorned its ports. His early transitional years passed like those of any Spanish child of that era, with a childhood marked by the recent loss of the last overseas possessions of the Spanish Empire, and by the economic ups and downs caused by the politics of those years in which the newly crowned King Alfonso XIII, together with politicians like the conservative Antonio Moras, tried to carry out the so-called, and according to some, failed Spanish regeneration. The so-called regenerative policies of Don Alfonso and Moras failed continuously, according to some scholars, for various reasons, including political instability and the increasing violent clashes with the new and growing workers and socialist groups, and because of the conflicts between the Spanish government and the rebels in its possessions in Morocco. But despite all these events, Luis's life goes on with relative normalcy. And in 1910, at the age of 14, possibly altering his birth certificate to meet the minimum age requirement, he enters the Naval School of San Fernando, where he stands out for his discipline and excellence. At the same time, he acquires knowledge about navigation, naval tactics, and submarine tactics. Between 1920 and 1921, he does his training on the ship Reina Regente, with which he travels to South America, being promoted to Ferdinand Navier. Overcoming the Congress of the difficulties of the 20th century makes him Guzmán de l'Option. Jalisco Nayueguero, Miguel, cousin of Rivera, is the one who manages to establish a village. Political and social instability and anarchy persisted for nearly 7 years before Spain achieved order, progress, and stability. During the time Carrero Blanco, the protagonist of this video, was in Morocco, the young man was present at the landing of Alcázar Sager in 1925, where he supported the Legion troops, and the regulars, through coastal bombardments from the Arquilla Coast Guard, contributed to establishing a base of operations in that region. In addition, he took part in the famous landing at Alucernas in September 1925, which was a crucial event, which allowed the Spanish forces to take control of strategic and key areas that contributed to the final pacification of the Rif in 1927 and to the Spanish victory. His outstanding performance in these operations earned him a rapid promotion within the Navy, being promoted to lieutenant in 1926, which marked the beginning of a successful military career. After the Rif War, at the age of 31 in 1935, he was appointed as a professor at the Naval School of Madrid during a time of particular importance for his future as a politician. After the overthrow of General Primo de Rivera by both ultra-monarchist and Republican factions, Spain once again faced heavy instability, which led to the establishment of the famous Second Spanish Republic on April 14, 1931, a period for which we have an interesting documentary that we invite you to watch during these turbulent years. It was created by young men like José Antonio Primo de Rivera, Ramiro Ledesma Ramos, and Onésimo Ribera. The Falange Española de las Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista Party, whose fundamental principles are the construction of a corporatist, syndicalist state, national unity, and the exaltation of Spanish traditions. This party, although small at the beginning, will give people a lot to talk about in a few years. For its part, the Second Republic quickly adopts a system of government oriented towards secular and anti-clerical, socialist and religious, republican tendencies. And as an ideological beacon, groups that promoted class struggle and the separation of Spain into autonomous communities began generating increasing political and social conflict. And this regime, before solving all the problems it set out to address, ended up making them worse with economic reforms considered radical by some, which deepened a heavy economic crisis. There were also strikes and protests, armed political groups, shootings and deaths due to political struggles became commonplace. A growing situation of political, social, and institutional anarchy led to the response known as the National Uprising. On July 17, 1936, conservative, Catholic, nationalist, and monarchist groups rose up against the established government because they considered it incapable of maintaining the unity of Spain and public order. This uprising was soon led by a military officer with a long career in the army, decorated by many Spaniards as a war hero for his military actions in past decades. We're talking about General Francisco Franco, right? As we mentioned, several sectors of the national civil politics joined this uprising, such as monarchists, right-wingers, conservatives, and phalangists, creating the so-called National Front. Meanwhile, in defense of the Second Republic, all leftist tendencies, both moderate and radical, as well as some liberal and workers' groups, unite, especially those like the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo de Federación Anarquista Ibérica and the Unión General de Trabajadores, known as the Popular Front. This is how the bloody Spanish Civil War began, which would last for 3 years, between 1936 and 1937. Franco took absolute command of the National Front as head of the armies, head of the state government, and head of the newly created party that merged the Falange of the Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista with the Carlists and other social forces, which would be called the National Movement. Carrero Blanco, as a military man, quickly ended up aligning himself with the National Front and fought in its ranks during this conflict. In 1937, he was appointed naval liaison of the Northern Army, taking part in the occupation of Santander and later assuming command of the submarine General San Giorgio. In 1938, he carried out blockade missions in the Mediterranean. Later, he became chief of staff of the cruiser division aboard the cruiser Canarias, a position he held until the end of the war. The conflict ended in April 1939 with the victory of the nationalist armies, led by Franco. Carrero Blanco was appointed Chief of Operations for the Navy General Staff, where he would perform exceptional work, which would be an important step in his rise to power. After his victory in the Civil War, considered by his followers as a national crusade for Catholic civilization, Franco, now called the Caudillo of Spain by the grace of God, reorganized the Spanish government to begin a new phase of rehabilitation. From that Spain, ruined by war and in the eye of the storm of a new world war. In this new post-war regime, Franco is confirmed as head of state and president of the government. He governs under a system supported by the armed forces, the Catholic Church, and the so-called national movement, made up, among other forces, of the Single Party, officially called the Traditionalist Spanish Phalanx. And about the Johns? In this system, Franco, as the head of Spain, had the final say on major issues, many of which were also discussed in the Spanish Parliament, which under Francoism was made up of representatives from municipalities, families, unions, and guilds. As we mentioned, at the end of the war, Luis Carrero Blanco took on the position of Chief of Operations of the Navy General Staff. In this position, in November 1940, Luis Carrero Blanco wrote a brilliant document in which he analyzed the state of Europe at that time, witnessing the rise of National Socialist Germany. And at the same time, he explained the reasons why it was unsustainable for Spain to enter World War II in this document. Walter Blanco. Dynamic 40, a position he will hold for most of Franco's government, which allows him to quickly rise through the ranks of Spanish power. For his part, going back to the years of World War II, Franco, in fact, as Carrero Blanco's report stated, keeps Spain neutral through tough and complex maneuvers, dealing with the different opposing sides. He spares Spain. During the World War, more destruction than it was already experiencing. However, after this World War, Franco's Spain once again enters a difficult international situation. As one of the few distinctly nationalist regimes that survived in Europe after the Second World War, and which also maintained certain aspects of sovereignty. The truth is that during the Cold War, between liberal capitalism and the Soviet order, Franco's Spain would be subjected to countless pressures, such as harsh economic and diplomatic blockades, both from Soviet and communist sectors, but mainly from Western nations, such as the United States and much of Europe. Pressures that came from these powers in order to make Spain's social, political, and economic order adapt to the interests of these external powers. Franco, although remaining firm on some things, has to give in on others and will make agreements with the victors of the war. The American power to the point that he accepts the installation of American bases on Spanish soil in 1953. In exchange for new cooperation agreements and for hostilities against Spain to cease, Carrero Blanco plays an active role in these negotiations that brought Spain into the Western Bloc, although only partially and with conditions. This major geopolitical clash will be decisive not just for Spain, but also for the very life of the protagonist of the video, Carrero Blanco, and even for its outcome. As we will see later, Carrero Blanco studies the complex international situation to which Spain was subjected, not only as a reader and thinker, but also as an actor directly involved in the events. In those negotiations, Carrero comes to understand the importance of Spain strengthening itself in the face of international powers that have no friends, only interests. Going back to the early years of the Francoist government, once Carrero Blanco earns Franco's good opinion, he goes to work with him as Undersecretary of the Presidency. At 36 years old, the personal relationship between the two gradually grows stronger. Carrero views Franco as a key mentor and shares his perspective on Spain's main issues and solutions. He even stated, quote, that he was totally identified with the political work of the caudillo, end quote, and that his loyalty to him was total, pure, and clear. Between the 1940s and 1960s, Franco's Spain slowly but steadily became stronger economically and socially. Industry, agriculture, and other key sectors saw a significant boost. Meanwhile, living conditions improved with stable jobs, housing, social peace, and public safety. Throughout all these years, Carrero Blanco worked closely alongside Franco, also holding other positions such as Minister of the Presidency, Member of the Cortes, and even Vice President of the government. From these positions, he would help Franco carry out his duties as head of state, and in addition, he gradually consolidated his own leadership within Spain during these decades. Carrero handled many official duties essential to the state's daily operations, and the Spanish government coming to control the daily agenda of the executive power and meeting up to 3 times. In addition, he carried out important unofficial duties, serving as a mediator and conflict resolver among the different groups vying for power within Francoism, such as monarchists, phalangists, technocrats, among others. At the same time, he coordinated the propaganda apparatus of Francoism. He even wrote articles under pseudonyms for a while, just like Franco himself did, where Carrero insisted on topics such as the importance of Spain's military, economic, and energy sovereignty. Between the 1940s and 1950s, Carrero became Franco's right-hand man and a leading figure of Francoism. It was Carrero Blanco who in 1947 promoted the so-called Law of Succession, which established that Spain, in its legal system, was a monarchical kingdom, but whose successor would be appointed by Francisco Franco, whether it was a member of the Bourbon family or any other person he considered suitable. This consolidated Franco's authority, but it opened up the big problem of who would be the successor. Another milestone in his career is the decisive influence of Carrero Blanco on the substantial government change that occurred in Francoism in 1957. Carrero promotes the prominence of the so-called technocrats linked to Opus Dei, who sought to modernize Spain's administration and economy. In addition, he actively collaborates in the famous development plans that give a great economic boost to Spain. In the 1960s, Carrero continued to strengthen his power, and as Franco grew older, Carrero became the key figure in Spain for the continuity of Francoism. One way to make this official was when, on September 21, 1967, Franco appointed Carrero Blanco as vice president of the government. Franco not only saw Carrero as his right-hand man, but also as his legitimate heir in leading the government and the national movement. He was the sole high-ranking official who supported him firmly for 30 years, and who had also proven his talent, his sobriety, and his wisdom in matters of the state. At official events and even during Franco's vacations, it was common to see Luis Carrero Blanco by his side, talking and sometimes laughing, which also showed a personal camaraderie. The truth is that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, as Franco's health worsened, the stability and social peace achieved by the regime were also coming to an end. For more than 30 years in Spain, within the Francoist regime itself, opposing trends had taken root regarding the future of Spain after Franco. On one side were the most conservative and Francoist, pejoratively called the immobilistas, who advocated for a continuation, to a large extent, of Francoism and its principles, once Franco was dead. Meanwhile, more reformist or aperturista groups pushed for opening up and democratizing Spain, following the example of Western democracies. Carrero Blanco was a staunch defender of the continuous, opposing liberal reforms that could weaken the national movement and Francoism. This led to several silent conflicts between Carrero and other ministers of Francoism during these years. On the other hand, at the international level, within the tense relationship that Spain had with the United States and other Western powers, these international actors pressured Franco hard and constantly to change the Francoist model in Spain for one more aligned with these foreign powers, while also pressuring him to appoint a successor who would be friendly to these international powers. We're talking about the time when the United States was at the height of its power as the great global hegemon, willing to force the politics of any nation in its favor in this international struggle. Carrero Blanco was one of the most powerful figures within Spain, who most strongly advocated for its political and military sovereignty. Sometimes he even stood above Franco himself, who had taken a more conciliatory approach on certain matters. One of the most sensitive issues was that of energy and nuclear power in the world. Since 1963, Spain had been running a secret project to provide itself with nuclear energy and weapons in order to strengthen its position on the complex international stage. Carrero, between the 60s and 70s, was one of the most powerful figures who most strongly defended Spain's nuclear development. However, the United States put heavy pressure to prevent these nuclear projects from being carried out, as we will see later. At the same time, in the midst of the Cold War and the Middle East conflict of those decades, Carrero was one of the government figures who most strongly refused to allow the United States to use the bases built in Spain. This kind of behavior displeased men like Henry Kissinger, the United States Secretary of State, who stated in his memoirs that the best thing for Americans was to establish good relations with the moderate and anti-Franco groups in Spain, so that once Franco was dead, the United States would already have the necessary level of influence in that future Spain. On the other hand, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, other internal social tensions flared up in Spain. The church, which had been one of the essential pillars of Franco's regime, began to turn its back on him, condemning his methods for preserving public order. At the same time, the Communist Party, the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, and many left-wing organizations that had remained underground for years, they began to carry out intense days of protest in Madrid, which resulted in violent clashes with the state's security forces. However, there is another factor to mention that is relevant for understanding the outcome of Carrero Blanco, and that is the emerging return of armed and actively violent groups that carried out attacks of various kinds promoting separatism in their regions. From the rest of Spain, mainly groups like the famous Euskadi ta Askatasuna, which in Basque means Basque country and freedom. A political and armed group founded in the 1950s as a dissidence from the Basque Nationalist Party, a group that was abjectly opposed to all the principles of Franco's national movement, and thus began a series of subversive activities that at first did not have much impact, but over time became increasingly violent, with kidnappings and murders of members of the law enforcement forces. In this heavy atmosphere of internal and external pressures, numerous changes began to occur in the Francoist regime. On July 22, 1969, the Spanish Cortes ratified Franco's decision that, by virtue of the law of succession, the then Prince of Spain, Juan Carlos de Bourbon, would be the successor as king. In this way, the matter of who would succeed Franco was decided. This news was met with different reactions from Spanish politicians. The more conservative sectors, the Phalangists and the Francoists, do not look upon it favorably. However, the reformists and those in favor of opening up, as well as the United States and its allies, are more than pleased, since they see in the young prince someone approachable, more manageable, and with a more liberal mindset, a key piece in the transformation of Franco's regime into something much more similar to the so-called Western democracies of that time. Now then, in this complex game of powers and pressures, while Franco names Juan Carlos as his successor, he also appoints someone even more aligned with the national movement and Francoism, someone who would serve as an essential counterweight against the measures of the reformists and those that the groups close to Juan Carlos would take after his death. This man is none other than Luis Carrero Blanco, to whom Franco handed over the position of President of the Government of Spain on June 9, 1973, the second most important position within Spanish politics. Carrero Blanco, it should be noted, is described by everyone who knew him as an extremely courteous, neat, impeccable man with undeniable patriotic faith. In fact, there were groups who expected that after Franco's death, he would put an end to several of the flaws that existed in the regime's public administration and the army. When he becomes prime minister, in what are believed to be Franco's final days, Carrero Blanco was expected to assume the key tasks that Franco, now 81, could no longer handle, but also that, upon his death, for many, he had the great and crucial mission of being the guarantor of the continuity of the work and principles of the national regime. In this way, most of the internal and external interests opposed to Franco's policies, they see Carrero Blanco as the main stumbling block preventing Spain from quickly moving from the nationalist regime to a different model. Carrero Blanco was not only the most respected man in the current Spanish government after Franco, but also a figure of strong and cunning character. Therefore, various actors begin to conspire quietly, and in this way, a plot against the life of the Spanish prime minister is orchestrated just a few months after he took office. For December 19, 1973, Carrero Blanco and the United States Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, hold a peculiar meeting of about an hour at the headquarters of the Prime Minister's office. During this special tour by Kissinger, it is said that the meeting, although pleasant, was tense, since Henry Kissinger insisted that Spain allow greater use of the United States military bases on its territory, and also completely abandon any nuclear project on Spanish soil. But Carrero Blanco, who continuously advocated for the country's autonomy and was known to be anti-American, was not favorable to these and other proposals from Kissinger. The next day, Thursday, December 20th at 9 in the morning, Carrero Blanco leaves his residence on Hermanos Becker Street and heads to the San Francisco de Borja Church to attend Mass, as he did every day. At 9:27 in the morning after leaving Mass, he gets into his official car, a Dodge 3700 GT, which was not armored, and drives along Claudio Coelho Street, interestingly close to the United States Embassy, on his way to his office, when a tremendous underground explosion occurs right beneath where his car was passing. The force of the explosion is such that it opens a crater in the ground, and the 1.8-ton car is thrown into the air, falling into the courtyard of the house next to a building attached to the church from which Carrero Blanco had just left, who surprisingly does not die instantly, but is seriously injured. The state security forces quickly arrive at the scene, and at first, they think it was a gas explosion and that the Prime Minister's car was buried in the crater opened in the ground, the same crater that had been flooded by a broken water pipe. However, it was some priest from the professed house who reported that the car was lying in the courtyard of that building with 3 people inside. That's when the authorities realized that it was a targeted attack. Carrero Blanco's companions, Police Inspector Juan Antonio Bueno Fernandez, and the driver of the vehicle, Jose Luis Perez Mojena, are removed from the car, lifeless, but Carrero Blanco, still showing vital signs, is taken to Francisco Franco Hospital. However, it is not known exactly whether it was just minutes after being admitted or even before. Around 10 in the morning, the acting president of the government of Spain passes away. The news spreads quickly and generates a strong reaction in all sectors of politics. While the communist opposition celebrates what they call tyrannicide, a large part of the Spanish people mourns the death of Carrero Blanco. Generalissimo Franco, who was sick with a fever that day, receives the news from his doctor, who breaks it to him gradually. First, he was told that Carrero was in serious condition, then informed of his death. According to the doctor, Franco responded that such things happen at night. The Sequia commando of the Euskadi Ta Askatasuna group, exiled in France, claimed responsibility for the attack on Carrero, and this became the official version. However, as we will see, this version has been questioned as a complete explanation of the events, and we will see why. Finally, that same morning, the official bulletin was issued confirming the death of Luis Carrero Blanco, president of the government of Spain, due to multiple injuries caused by the explosion in the attack. This event, the assassination of a high-ranking official in 1970s, Spain caused shock and raised many doubts due to irregularities in the official explanations. First of all, Euskadi Ta Askatasuna, as its own members admitted, had no experience in attacks of that magnitude. They didn't know about explosives, and until then their operations had only involved a few homicides and kidnappings. The attack, analyzed at the time and in later years, turned out to be so precise and detailed that some have wondered whether Euskadi Ta Askatasuna alone was capable of carrying it out. The explosives were military-grade C4, manufactured only in the United States. These details, combined with the international political situation of Spain and Carrero Blanco in relation to the powers we've explained, they have led scholars like Luis Segura, in his book The Assassination of Carrero, to claim that there are strong indications to believe that elements of American power, through an organization like the CIA, were the ones who orchestrated and financed this attack, with Euskadi Ta Askatasuna being just the executing arm. Another aspect that should not be overlooked is that we should remember that the American embassy was located right behind Claudio Coelho Street, where the attack took place. Notably, attention has focused on the tunnel dug by Euskadi Ta Askatasuna members. Under that street went unnoticed by the surveillance of the American embassy, which had the area well guarded, especially in light of the visit of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. As we've shown throughout the video, Carrero Blanco was the main obstacle in Spain for the United States and foreign powers. And while no hypothesis can be stated with certainty, the theory of American involvement in the assassination of the president of the government has gained traction, whether as the main organizers or by helping the Francoist opposition that sought the same thing. Another aspect that should be mentioned is the security failures regarding Carrero Blanco, for which the then Minister of the Interior, Carlos Arias Navarro, was responsible. They suggest a possible collaboration between internal and reformist sectors of Francoism and the Euskadi Ta Askatasuna group. One of these failures is that since Carrero was appointed as president of the government, there had been many requests to strengthen his personal security, and these requests were ignored by Arias Navarro himself. In turn, several Euskadi Ta Askatasuna members claimed that it was representatives of the Francoist government who provided them with Carrero Blanco's exact routes, which allowed them to organize the attack perfectly. These controversial events about Carrero Blanco's disappearance have been discussed for over 50 years, and they open the window to a story that has not been clearly told about the truth behind this event, which ultimately impacted the fate of Spain. Once authorized by the doctors, the deceased body of Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco is transferred from the hospital to the presidential headquarters at Paseo de la Castellana No. 3, where the funeral chapel was set up, and the funeral was held the following day. Prince Juan Carlos attends these events on behalf of General Franco, who was in poor health. However, the Caudillo surprisingly appears the next day, December 22, to preside over a mass in memory of the late president of the government. Franco looked visibly weakened. When he leaves the mass, he proceeds to greet Carrero's family, and when he shakes hands with the widow, in a way never seen in public before, the Caudillo breaks down in inconsolable tears. They had ended in a cowardly and abrupt way the life of the man who had accompanied him for more than 30 years. In a world of betrayal and lies, who devoted his life to ruling Spain at his right hand? And more than all that, perhaps one of the few men he could still call a friend on that lonely summit of power. What came next is history. The then Minister of Foreign Affairs in Carrero Blanco's government, Laureano Lopez Rodo, would say, after Franco lost his closest collaborator, he was never the same. He clearly declined, both physically and psychologically, indeed surrounded by a situation that deserves a separate video. Franco dies on November 20th, 1975, and automatically becomes head of state and king of Spain. Juan Carlos de Borbón, who will rule under the name Juan Carlos I, with King Juan Carlos. And with the gradual incorporation of opposition parties to Francoism and the opening of the regime, a process of transition begins that ends with the promulgation of the 1978 Constitution, which buried the principles of the national movement that King Juan Carlos had sworn to defend years earlier, and established a system of party democracy that currently prevails in Spain. Carrero Blanco's death ended any chance of moderate or firm continuity, but it was, after all, the continuity of the principles and policies of a specific and consolidated sector of Francoism in power. And more than that, it was the end of the last statesman who had governed with Franco since the beginning. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. And I remind you that below you can get the new encyclopedia in English and the new encyclopedia in Portuguese. Like all the videos on those channels, share them with your friends. Check out the content that's really worth it. And, well, subscribe to both platforms. Thank you all very much, and may God bless you.